What started on the drawing board became a trophy. Engineers at Federal Premium Ammunition designed the trophy bonded tip bullet to deliver devastating bone-crushing performance. With a translucent polymer tip and boat tail design, Trophy Tip provides flatter trajectories and improved accuracy. Plus, a solid copper shank jacket and bonded core mean high weight retention and deep penetration. Trophy Bonded Tip from Federal Premium Ammunition. Claim your trophy.
From the Deer and Deer Hunting headquarters here in Iola, Wisconsin, welcome once again to Deer Talk Now. Along with Brad Rux, I'm Dan Schmidt. Thanks for joining us. We have a really good show in store for you today. We're going to tell you or teach you how you can fill your freezer fast when bow season starts with an innovative way of calling to deer that you might not have thought of before. Brad, we've talked about this for years. We've both done it. We're going to have Jerry Peterson from Woods Wise Products, what I would consider a pioneer in not only deer calling, but deer biology, deer management. Jerry knows his stuff when it comes to whitetails.
Absolutely. I mean, he's been calling whitetails long before we did. You know, before most people even had heard about a ground tube, he had been experimenting with calls. So, I mean, it's a great, fascinating story, and he's a good guy. We're
going to have Jerry on here in a minute. Jerry, basically, I ran a story about Jerry in the magazine. It's been a few years now. And he was a bow hunter before bow hunting was cool. He basically started in the late 1960s, throughout the 1970s. It started down in Florida. He's hunted all over the place. He's going to teach us some things, again, about calling to deer socially, which I think is fascinating because when you're calling to doe groups as opposed to a single deer, that's really going to take your game to the next level. Yeah. We're going to learn about that here in a second. Brad, let's just talk a little bit. We got bow seasons starting here. Well, some of them are already going if you're in Florida. Congratulations, you get to bow hunt right now. I get to bow hunt in North Dakota here in about 2 weeks.
Me too.
What are you looking forward to, Brad? I know you got some trips on the schedule, and I know you've been seeing some really nice deer on your place on your trail cameras.
We've seen a lot of 3-year-olds on my home farm. They're very active, especially, you know, it cooled down a little bit because it was hotter in July and we didn't have any rain. Now we've been getting tons of rain here in August. It's been cool. I mean, a couple in the mornings it was in the 40s. And the 3-year-olds, especially 3s and 2s, are on their feet. So my kids are so excited. But we've seen a couple of really good deer on the home farm, so I'm excited to get out there for that. But I'm going to Kentucky, hunting with Premier Outfitters, excited about it. It's a great spot. Mark's a good guy. And the one thing you're going to see quality animals. I mean, you should be able to shoot one, but if not, you're going to see them at least.
Same thing here. Boy, that Kentucky trip sounds awesome. I get to go out to North Dakota here, hunting with Chris Jorday at Heart J Outfitters. If you haven't seen his website, check it out. North Dakota, kind of a sleeper state when it comes to whitetails.
He's been sending me the pictures because Dan would be probably overloaded in excitement if he sees them, but I still had to fill in Dan a little bit.
He had to show me. Brad had to show me these pictures, and I said, yeah, any one of those bucks is going to do just fine. So looking forward to that. Brad, we have a couple things going on in the store special today, especially for today with Jerry being on the show. We have the one and only, it's the Hot Mama call. We've talked about it a lot. I'm going to just pull this one out. You have the fawn call there. And why don't you go ahead and
show... A little fawn distress.
Listen.
You just want to put a little quiver in this thing, you know, and if you can do it and do it well early season, those does are just going to come running into it. It's like they're on a suicide mission.
Basically, that's the maternal instinct that's playing too. Jerry's going to tell us more about his calls. But the Hot Mama call, this one I've been talking about since Jerry introduced it several years ago. The cool thing about this call is you can call in a doe, you can call in a buck. I like that because I can fill my freezer pretty quick. I shot my first Pope and Young deer using this call, and it's a real easy call to use. It's got a flexible chamber on there, and it's just. Jerry's going to teach us how to use that, but basically it's as simple as inhaling and exhaling deadly during the pre-rut.
And if you buy one of these, do not take it apart because they are hard to get back
together.
Do not
take it apart.
Mine doesn't sound anywhere near like this anymore.
It's built to work right out of the box. Jerry's going to talk about it. It's called the Hot Mama Call. Today's Shop Deer special. Just check it out there, shopdeerhunting.com. You can order it from us. We have limited supplies. Get it from us because you can't find it everywhere. This is the call that's going to help you and the cool thing, like I said, you can call in a doe, you can call in a buck. So I'm out there September 5th, and I want to put a doe in the freezer, and it's out there a little ways. I can call to that doe, and she's going to respond, hopefully, and we're going to have meat in the freezer. But let's get Jerry on the line. And I should mention, on the Shop Deer specials, just always mention Deer Talk and get your special discount right there in the checkout box. It's Deer Talk. Just put it in there. You saw it on Deer Talk now. We want to make sure that you get the discount for that. We also have a tent sale going on right now at Shop Deer. Everything's, it's like 75% off. You can get DVDs, you can get deer gear, whatever you need for the upcoming season. It's right there right now. Just this week only on the tent sale, but the tent sale's got a big banner on there. Check it out. Let's get Jerry on the line, Brad, and we're going to talk about early season calling.
Hello?
Hi, Jerry. Jerry, Dan Schmidt, Brad Rux, Deer Talk Now, Deer and Deer Hunting. How are you doing this morning?
Hey, doing great. How are you doing this morning?
We're doing fabulous. We're talking about deer hunting. Brad's got me all worked up because he's sending me trail camera photos, and we're still 3 weeks away.
Well, I'll tell you what, my anticipation of the season is running full tilt. In fact, there's a nice 8-point buck walking outside my window in the woods, and I'm thinking, wonder where I can put a tree stand around him.
Tis the season. Well, thanks for joining us today, Jerry. We gave the viewers just a brief look at what we're going to talk about today, but let's back up for a second, Jerry. We know you so well that we take for granted that everybody knows your background, not only in the hunting industry, but in the deer world. Can you give everybody just a brief snapshot of where you've come from and what you've done over the past 30 plus years?
Yeah, I hate to think of how many years it is. Probably my greatest notoriety is with the introduction of deer calls back in 1985, but my experience with calling deer actually extends into the late 1960s when my cousins out west showed me how they were using predator calls to call up blacktail and mule deer out there. And of course, I carried that interest into whitetail, when I got back from my summer vacations out there. And when I got into school, the research was going on whitetail vocalization, and I just was all over it, being an avid bow hunter. And I think sometimes because I didn't have a lot of, quote, experts to muddle with my thinking about how and why a deer call works, or for that matter didn't work, that I was able to start with just the raw research and start to apply it in a logical fashion based on deer behavior. So as I mentioned, in 1985, with the encouragement of some people that I knew in the industry, I started Woodswise game calls as really more of a hobby business than it was ever intended to be a full-time activity. And all I can say is it exploded so fast that decisions had to be made, and I've been full-time in the industry ever since.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I find really fascinating, Jerry, is that you've not only been doing it for such a long time, but you've figured out some of these things that a lot of people think about all the time, as far as, like we were talking, Brad, when some people think about calling, they think, I'm going to take a grunt call out with me in November, first week of November, and if that buck is going 50, 60 yards away from me and going the opposite direction, I'm going to try to call that deer back in. Well, Jerry's, he's taken that, but he said, no, there's people out there in September who want to call, like I said, maybe to a doe group, they maybe they're trying other things out. So Jerry's actually mastered vocalization. You can go to his website. He's actually has videos on this stuff called Vocal Whitetail, one of the pioneer things on different vocalizations, what they mean, and how you can use them as a hunter to be more successful. And that's what we wanted to talk about today, Jerry, was about early season, because it's the season. We're getting close, and a lot of guys saying, yeah, I would love to put a big buck on the wall, but at the same time, I didn't realize I can use a bleat call, a doe bleat call or a fawn bleat call, to maybe put a doe in the freezer right away.
Absolutely. if your primary technique for calling a buck is going to be that loud, aggressive sniff, wheeze, and growl and roar and all of those types of aggravated grunts and horn rattling, you've got a long wait before that style of calling is going to work. What people don't realize is that deer are very social. And this time of year, as we're going into these late August and early September hunts and even into early October, we are dealing with deer that are broken up into two primary social groups, the buck bachelor group on the one hand, and then the maternal family doe group on the other. The bachelor group could be bucks of various ages, everything from yearlings from last year up to the oldest buck in the area. They enjoy each other's company, and they spend most of the summer together, and they travel back and forth in a very predictable pattern, which really makes them vulnerable year. And the doe groups are busy not only raising the fawns of the year, but the extended maternal group is built around usually an older doe, her daughters, and then the young of the year. But also in that group are the yearling bucks. And so to keep the groups together, there is a common language that most hunters really seem to be unaware of or have forgotten about, with all the emphasis being on aggressive calling and rattling. To simplify it, years ago, we came up with a simple way to remember it: ABC: attention grunt, bleat, and contact call. And they're really very basic, very soft versions of each of the type of calls. In other words, a grunt is going to be just simply a little short, simple, not loud, but fairly medium to soft tone like this. In other words, none of that long, aggravated, drawn-out type of grunt that you're going to use later, and nowhere near the volume. You've got the volume about right if you were to have a friend back away about 75 yards away from you and use the call, and you only want to be loud enough that you can definitely hear it, but it isn't, kind of an overwhelming thing. A bleat is just a plain bleats. Bucks and does bleat. Again, they have a common language, so it's just a simple little short bleat like this. Nothing drawn out. But probably the most underused and most significant sound deer make year-round is what Dr. Marchington at the University of Georgia identified as a contact call. It's a call that deer use when they're separated and trying to find each other. In other words, trying to make contact with each other. It basically says, I'm over here, I'm lost or separated, come to me or let me know where you are. And we dubbed it Ma-Ma because that's what it sounds like the deer is saying. Again, like I said, Dr. Marchington rated this as the most important sound because it keeps the group together. Whether you're in the early season in these family groups and bachelor groups, or whether we're in the pre-rut, we're in the peak of the rut, or even in the post-rut period. So this is what a contact from Ma-Ma sounds like. And as you can hear, sounds like the deer saying Ma-Ma. So it's those are if you deal with deer on that basis, those three sounds, I promise you're going to have more success than you ever realized possible. And we can break the season down a little tighter. You have to start thinking about that September through October is a transition period, especially for the buck group, but also for the doe time out in the deer woods. Let me just check with you and see what's your key sign on getting onto a bachelor group in the early season. What do you look for when you're out scouting?
When I'm out scouting, Jerry, basically it's as simple as just following the sign that I can see. And today's day, a lot of that, like what we're doing, is with trail cameras. And thankfully, we have some feeding. We can manipulate feeding spots with food plots. But now, one thing that you taught me, and this is going back over 15 years ago, is using that native forage habits, especially hard mast early in the season, to find out where those deer are. And normally, if I can find that, I can find bachelor groups of bucks, and I can find the interesting thing that you mentioned, and there's something that we've preached till we're blue in the face about the social structure of does and how does live in these interconnected circles of maternally related individuals. And what I mean by that is, and one thing you alluded to, is when you have a mature doe and then somebody goes out and says, well, I saw 20 does today over their property and however big that property is. And I said, well, did you ever think about that? You're looking at, there's a doe and 2 fawns here, there's a doe and 2 fawns there, here's a group of 5 deer, but that could be the grandmother all the way down to, I guess you would say the grandchildren or grand deer or whatever. And that's what I'm looking for, is I'm looking for where these deer are living on, because we know how they live on their home ranges. And then to put that together is, okay, I know that these deer are living in this home range. I know this buck, especially if he's a mature buck, he's got a core area of maybe 200 acres. He's got a home range of more than 650 acres. And I'm trying to hone in on those parts of his territory. Now, when I'm hunting and I'm hanging my stands, I know I might be in his core area. I might be very close to it. I might be within 50 to 100 yards of the best of his home range. But one thing that has helped me particularly is, I won't consider myself a master caller by any stretch of the imagination, but understanding contact calls and what they mean and how they work. Rather than, I have a grunt call in my hand and I'm going to blow it because I saw a buck. Rather than thinking in those terms, I'm thinking in, okay, contact call, how can I pretend that I'm part of this social group of these deer, especially if that deer, I know that deer's in this area, how can I bring him 50 yards closer to maybe check out where I'm sitting? That's kind of how I approach it. I approach it basically knowing how the deer use that habitat, how they're dispersed across the habitat as far as living arrangements, and then trying to somehow, it doesn't work all the time, but trying to fit into that social structure. And maybe it doesn't work all the time, but maybe get that deer to come a little bit closer with a contact call, as opposed to, like Jerry said, something that's aggressive, that's usually reserved for the first week of November during the real good seeking and chasing phases of the rut.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted you to lay that basic groundwork out because, it's one thing to know the ABCs. And by the way, one of the calls that's available in the deer shop there at Deer Hunting is our Super Hot Mama. And one of the things I like to do so that I have the ABCs is I'll take the upper end. It's a 2-reed system. I'll pull the top off, and that'll expose the reed, and you'll find an O-ring on it. And in the early season, I'll roll that O-ring down so that it's a grunt. A grunt when I exhale, and a bleat and mama or contact call when I inhale. So I've got one call that has everything going on all at the same time. And that's why we designed it that way. It opens up the opportunity to be versatile with it. Getting back to, I asked you that leading question about scouting because a lot of guys get confused sometimes in the early season with the sign that they're finding. Sometime in late August, around the 1st of September, the velvet shed takes place, and this is in response to changes in the testosterone level in the bucks. And they begin to spar, and they begin to do what you might call shadow boxing with overhanging limbs, where they'll get their antlers into those limbs and just kind of thrash around. And what you find in the early season is small sign evidence, not these big signpost rubs that you may see later. And one of the things in particular I like to look for in scouting for a buck travel corridor in the early season is some small limbs, maybe about the size of your little finger, that have been twisted, mangled, snapped in half, and sometimes even torn right out of the ground. And also looking for overhanging limbs that are similarly thrashed. Because those bucks are on a daily travel pattern, this tells you that you're in a zone where those bucks are going to travel to and from bedding to feeding. In other words, these are travel corridors and funnels and transitioning areas leading out to the large food sources. And if you can find those travel corridors, now you really are on top of a situation where you can find not only, smaller bucks, but obviously some of the biggest bucks on your property. And then you can dial in on using calling techniques specifically catered to that buck bachelor group. In addition to ABC, attention, grunt, bleat, contact call, which you can and should be using periodically just as blind calling techniques, maybe one or two contact calls, wait a minute or two, maybe a plain grunt. But in addition, we have a real opportunity in the early season, specifically when we're talking about bucks, to add one more social aspect of the buck population, and that is sparring. As soon as those antlers are hardened and the velvet comes off, those bucks begin to spar with each other. And I like to call sparring play with a purpose. In other words, the bucks are playing with each other, much like kids that wrestling in a schoolyard, but they're playing with a purpose. They're learning about each other. It's a sociable, peaceful way of sorting out pecking order so that people can, or in this case the bucks, can figure out where they fit within the social structure. You'll see different sized bucks sparring with each other. You may have the biggest buck on your property sparring with a spike, very much like a dad would wrestle with his son. But in that process of sparring with each other, they're learning. And there's a very ritualized behavior about it. If it gets too rough, they disengage, they pull their heads back, and they look away from each other and don't make any eye contact. Basically saying, whoop, this is getting a little too rough for me. And usually after you see them pull back like that, then the older buck in a sort of a submissive behavior saying, I'm not going to hurt you, just come on back and let's spar together. He'll drop his head down, and the smaller buck will re-engage with him with the confidence that he's not going to get hurt. Now, how does that play into your calling techniques? Very simply, people over the years, Dan, people have asked me, when do you rattle up your bucks? So, in other words, when's the best time? I always laugh and I'll say early season, and they look at me very puzzled, like, what are you talking about? That's supposed to be something that only works during the peak of the rut. And this had a lot to do with this sparring technique, had a lot to do with why I had invented and developed the rattle bag as one of my first products, because when you're bow hunting, all you want to do is just some light flicking and touching of the antlers, so you don't need a full set of antlers to accomplish sparring. And so I developed the rattle bag with the idea that I could do that type of thing. When I talk about sparring, I'm not talking about hauling back and really smacking the antlers together. I'm just talking about, just this light. And it's done in a start and stop feet pattern, and then I will add in because when they stop, I've heard deer kind of vocalize at each other. You may hear a little bleat, like, "Ooh, that was a little tough." I'm a little worried, so you can hear a buck bleat. You may hear just a soft little attention grunt, like, "Hey, it's okay. Everything's, we're not trying to beat each other up. I'm not mad at you." And so I'm going to mix in with my early season sparring, intermittent little grunts and little soft bleats. And you would be amazed. One of the interesting things that happens when you use these buck-specific social calls in the early season is that when you call one up, you call sometimes 4 or 5 or even 6 bucks in a group, which gets really interesting. And very often over the years when I've called them into that, because they think they're coming to another buck social group, and they don't find them right away, then they kind of break out into little sparring matches, and sometimes 3 or 4 of them pushing on each other at the same time. So that's one way to dial in on the social behavior of the bucks. On the other side of the equation comes the doe social sounds. Now, here's something very important again to remember about travel patterns in the early season. Both the bucks and does are all about traveling from bedding to feeding and from feeding back to bedding. Now, in the morning, it's very difficult, especially with the bucks, to head them off unless you get pretty far down their travel corridor, because they'll come off of those feeding areas, just when it starts getting gray light. The does may linger a little longer because the fawns are just eating machines, and they want to seem to pack in all the calories they can get, and so they will come off a little bit later. But your best time in the early seasons, whether you're hunting doe families or whether you're hunting buck bachelor groups, is the last 2 hours in the afternoon. The bucks, because of the heat, are going to lay up and not travel very much. The does on the other side are not going to have, in many cases, the opportunity to lay up through the middle of the day because, again, those fawns are little eating machines, and they'll be up in the middle of the day feeding, and very often Mama has to go out and stay with them in order to watch over them. But, again, your best time and your best calling techniques are going to be the ABC social calls. Now, doe specific, I would use, a doe in a doe voice. I would use a doe bleat and a contact call, and then I would also look to add in some of the fawn social calls, and that's another whole subject. Maybe we'll save for another day, but I'll cover that just by demonstration, and then we'll discuss some other specific techniques. But in other words, doe bleats, doe contact calls or mom-moms, and then some mild grunts, still sticking to the same call. Now think about this. I'm using the same call, that super hot mama call, and the only thing I've done for the early season is I've retuned the upper reed for a grunt, and I'm using the same 3 calls, sounding like a doe, sounding like the ABC sounds, and I'm now universally appealing to both the doe groups and the buck groups. Now, I mentioned fawn calls, and I see a lot of mistakes still being made today about using the fawn in distress. We're not talking about sounding like a fawn that's been caught in a fence or caught by a coyote or something like that. Fawns share the same common language. The difference is their voices are a little bit higher, and their voices are high enough that it's difficult to distinguish an actual grunt. So you can basically say a fawn bleats and contact calls, so you get sounds like these. Something like a plain bleat or a contact call. up the volume and try to call loud and really reach out long distances. If you can see a deer, your advantage is that you can up the volume to just about what is necessary to reach that deer, to get their attention and let them know you're there, and then back it down to what, again, I call normal volume, what you and I can hear about 75 yards clearly without it being loud.
Jerry, let me interrupt you 1 minute. We only have about 2 minutes left, and what I wanted, this is such great information, I just want to let you run with it, and we obviously have to have you on again because there's no way we can cover this in this short amount of show. But one thing that I wanted to touch on and get your insight on it as well, because it's something that everybody always asks us, whether you're doing a contact call or whether you're using a grunt call, like I said, during what everybody considers the magic time, the sweet spot of the rut. But the way I've used it over the years, as far as the contact calls, the mama call, the bleat calls, when I'm doing these things blind and I don't see a deer there, essentially I go into predator hunting mode. Because, and that's something that you taught me many years ago, is you just don't sit there in your tree stand with this call and blow on it, look around, and hang the call back up. Essentially, I got my bow on my knee, I got the arrow in there, I got my release most times snapped on. It's almost like I'm turkey hunting. Because a lot of times what happens is all of a sudden I look out of the corner, oh, there's a deer standing right there. I mean, 15 yards away, and she's standing and her ears are perked up. And I might have blew on that call 10 minutes ago or 15 minutes ago. I wanted to get your insight as far as when you're in the hunting application, what are some tips that you can give somebody, either A, on how to use that call, or B, how to prepare for the shot when that deer shows up?
You know, I get a lot of questions about that, and I get a ton of emails. I had one guy last year on one of the blogs that written a thing about using that lost fawn mama, and the deer kept showing up because he was hunting in tight cover, and he'd be pinned down for 30 minutes at a time, unable to take a shot. And he probably summed up my best advice to people in the early season. If you're going to use a social call, probably better be ready to make a shot. Whether you're have practiced well sitting down to make a shot. Me personally, when I get ready to call, I tend to stand up. I spend more time on my feet in the early season than I do any other time during the year in my stand, because you've got to be able to make those small adjustments if you're ready for a shot. And it's like you said, you blew the call, and in the early season, it's not like when you're rattling and doing this other kind of calling that's aggressive, where the deer just comes flying in crazy, and you have time to hear him, see him, and so forth. Typically, in the early season, when you're social calling, those deer show up. And it's usually very often about 5 or 10 minutes after you've used the call. And you can tell they're responding to the call because, like you said, ears are perked up, their eyes are scanning constantly around looking for the other deer. And sometimes I've heard them use that little soft attention grunt to say, "Where are you?" Just to let the deer know that they've come over, but they can't find you.
That's a great point. That little contact grunt, a lot of times you hear that and it's like, was that a deer? You're thinking, like, there's a deer behind, and it's invariably behind where it's behind you. Invariably, we'd love to have this all play out in front of us and the deer's out and it's going to come straight in, but it never happens. It's always either to the side of you or behind you, and you've got to be. The other thing is listen for squirrels. That people, I find it funny that people consider the squirrels a scourge of the deer woods when I consider them my best ally. Because how many times I'm sitting there and I blow on that call, 5 minutes go by, 10 minutes go by, and a gray squirrel goes off 50 yards behind me. oh, that squirrel's going to, no, a gray squirrel sees a deer walking through the woods is what it is. And it's like, that just gave me a great signal. There is a deer coming. And that might take that deer 25, 30 minutes before all of a sudden that thing feeds its way around, gets in front of me, and I called that deer in. But I didn't even know it until I put all this other stuff together to realize what was going on.
Yep. Yeah. The results are really laid back in the early season, but in other words, don't let your guard down. Another thing I always try to school any videographer that might be sitting with me is when I call, don't move, because sometimes your video guy thinks, oh, he's making noise so I can squirm around and stuff. Remember that when you use a call, just because you don't see a deer doesn't mean that a deer isn't close enough that it can look right at the spot. Deer have a tremendous ability to pinpoint exactly where that sound came from. And very often they'll stand there and watch. And what you're playing on in the early season is social curiosity. In other words, make them curious. I heard a deer over there. Now, why don't I see him? And that's the way calling is working for you in the early season. You're playing on their interest to find out what's going on within the social group.
All right, Jerry, I'd love to sit here and talk with you all day, and I would if I could, but we can't. Brad didn't get 2 words in edgewise.
That's all right.
That's okay. We're gonna let Brad talk next time. Jerry, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your time. Again, it's Jerry Peterson. His website, Jerry, is
Woodswise.com.
Woodswise.com. The call that you want to get from us today, the one we've talked about, the contact call, the Hot Mama plus Breeding Bellow, shopdeerhunting.com right now today. Get yourself one of these calls, and you're going to be surprised not only what the deer you're going to call in, but how you can change your game in hunting. You're going to be. This isn't something you use 10 days out of the year. You're going to be able to use this for the entire hunting season.
Don't forget to remind them that we have a special just for shoppers at your site, and that is that we will give them a free mini DVD on that Super Hot Mama.
That's right. I completely forgot about that. It is a DVD packed with all what Jerry's been talking and more. It's not a sales pitch. It's actual solid information that's going to make you a better deer hunter. Everything Jerry's known has researched for the past 30 plus years about deer behavior, deer socialization, and deer calling is in that DVD. Get it. It's a special. It's a bonus that Jerry actually just provided because he wants everybody to become better deer hunters and more informed deer hunters. Jerry, thank you very much, and hopefully we're going to meet you down the trail here pretty soon.
Thanks. Appreciate it, guys.
All right. Have a good day. Brad, Jerry is a good friend of ours. We've known him for a long time, and he's the kind of guy, I know he talked for a long time, but I just let Jerry talk because every time I talk to him, I learn something new about deer.
He's got great information. I mean, he knows his stuff in the back of his hand. He's out there and hunts as much as us, which says a lot in itself. But, just like you said, I deal with Jerry on the sales side as well. And one time he told me a little tip on something to do for turkeys, and I tried it, and I was like, oh my God, this works great. Yeah.
It works.
Yeah, it's just amazing.
What's interesting is, you can buy a deer call and think that this is the magic bullet. What Jerry arms you with is information. It's just like deer and deer hunting. That's why he's been such a partner for deer and deer hunting for such a long time. It's all about knowing the animal. It's knowing about how the animal works, how the animal lives, how the animal interacts on the landscape with other animals. And once you learn that stuff, you can put it all together and just become a much better deer hunter. Well, we got to thank Jerry. We're going to have him back on for everybody. That was a treat. The information and just learning about deer behavior. We're going to have Jerry back on. Until next week, thank you for joining us. I know today's show got a little bit long, but we sure hope you enjoyed it. He's Brad Rux. I'm Dan Schmidt. Thanks for joining us for Deer Talk Now. We'll see you again next week.